Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with a case that seems, well, on its face, utterly impossible to reconcile with basic forensic science. We are plunging into the historical record surrounding the tragic death of Ellen Ray Greenberg back in 2011. She was a 27-year-old first-grade teacher in Philadelphia. The core, unbelievable conflict here is this. She died having sustained 20 stab wounds, yet after months of institutional back and forth, her death was officially ruled a suicide. Our mission today is to take a really detailed look at the mountains of source material we have. You know, the police reports, the MEO reversals, the expert depositions, and the lengthy court filings. We are going to break down the conflicting investigations, analyze the stunning forensic evidence that makes the official ruling so controversial, and track the long-running, highly political legal battle that this single controversial finding ignited. This isn't just a true crime story. It's a masterclass in institutional failure and the catastrophic consequences of a compromised investigation.
Yeah, and what's truly foundational to understanding this case is setting the forensic stage right away. The fact that an individual sustained 20 distinct stab wounds, including 10 to the back and neck, plus 11 bruises across her arm, abdomen, and right leg, that immediately places this case in a unique and extremely rare category.
Extremely rare.
Absolutely. In forensic history, deaths involving multiple deep wounds, particularly those located on the back or neck, are almost universally classified as either homicide or, at minimum, undetermined. The suicide ruling in this instance is practically unprecedented in cases with this specific wound profile, which is exactly why this controversy hasn't faded over the last decade plus.
Yeah.
It forces us to ask, what pressure, what kind of external factors could possibly result in this finding?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with who Ellen was, setting the scene, and detailing the day this tragedy occurred. Ellen Ray Greenberg was born in 1983. She was, by all accounts, a bright young professional, had degrees from Penn State and Temple, and she was passionately teaching first grade at Juniata Park Academy in Philadelphia. She lived with her fiancé, Samuel Goldberg, in an apartment in the Manayunk neighborhood.
Right. The sources paint a picture of, domestic stability, or at least the appearance of it. Engaged, starting her career, living a seemingly normal life until January 26, 2011.
That day, a major blizzard hit Philadelphia, which actually allowed Ellen to leave work early and head home. The timeline here is tight and incredibly important. At approximately 6:40 p.m. that evening, she was pronounced dead at the scene.
And the immediate discovery is crucial because it sets up the entire highly disputed narrative that the initial investigators seemed to cling to. Goldberg claimed he returned home from the gym to find the apartment door secured with a swing latch, preventing his entry. He stated that after he couldn't reach her inside, he knocked the door down to gain access.
This detail of the secured door, that's the first point of contention, right? It suggests a locked room scenario, which is classic for a suicide investigation. But the most crucial detail of this entire initial report, and perhaps the key phrase that, poisoned the well, is what Goldberg stated in his 911 call.
That's right. The phrase that immediately introduced the notion of self-harm, preemptively framing the investigation before anyone really looked closely, was his statement that Greenberg stabbed herself and fell on a knife. That's the only way, at that very moment, to explain the knife and the blood without implicating someone else.
And the police immediately seem to accept this narrative.
It appears so. Despite the highly unusual circumstances, the scene was initially treated as a suicide by the responding officers. But this is where the rapid, almost dizzying changes began, creating massive institutional confusion right from the start.
Okay, walk us through that.
Precisely. The subsequent investigation immediately started swinging wildly between two diametrically opposed conclusions. First, after the autopsy was conducted, the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office, the MEO, made an official initial ruling of homicide.
Homicide.
Yes, homicide. And this conclusion aligns with the physical reality of 20 wounds, including those to the neck and back, which strongly suggest defense or attack, not self-harm.
A homicide ruling, which, to anyone looking at the raw wound count, seems the obvious initial classification, but then the very next day, we see the first sign of, institutional conflict.
Exactly. The Philadelphia Police Department publicly differed with that homicide conclusion. They acknowledged the death was suspicious, but they emphatically stated to the media, and crucially to the MEO, that it was not a homicide.
Wow. Okay, so you have the ME saying homicide, police saying no.
It represents an incredibly rare institutional disagreement unfolding in real time, publicly. We have the MEO, the forensic authority, stating homicide based on the body, and the police, the investigative authority, rejecting it.
Hmm.
And, well, the MEO folded under that pressure. By February 2011, less than a month after the death, the medical examiner's office reversed its own finding. They officially changed the manner of death to suicide.
I have to stop you there. For you listening who may not be familiar with the inner workings of a medical examiner's office, how is a reversal of that magnitude, from homicide to suicide, even possible in such a short period? Especially when the facts, the 20 wounds, remain unchanged.
That rapid reversal is the central point of contention, and it strongly suggests overwhelming external influence. Generally, a medical examiner will classify a death based on medical findings, what injuries exist, where they are, whether they are medically survivable or immediately incapacitating, things like that. To classify it as suicide, the ME must be able to reasonably rule out third-party involvement and confirm the injuries could be self-inflicted. The speed with which they abandon the homicide finding strongly suggests that investigators, the police, presented an alternative narrative, likely involving, alleged mental health history, or leaning heavily on that locked door theory, and essentially insisted the ME's office conform to the needs of the police department's initial, perhaps hastily formed, conclusion. This dramatic flip, ignoring the stark physical evidence of multiple deep stab wounds, immediately raises the question of undue institutional pressure. It's the fundamental flaw, really, that the subsequent legal battle seeks to exploit.
The forensic anomalies were only the start of this train wreck. Here's where it gets really interesting and frankly shocking regarding how the scene itself was handled. It makes any later attempt to reverse the suicide ruling nearly impossible because the investigation became fundamentally compromised by procedural failures almost immediately after the body was removed.
We're moving from questionable forensic classification to outright procedural negligence. The first and arguably most devastating failure is what some have dubbed the clean sweep.
Yeah. Detail this for us. It's hard to believe this actually happened in a death investigation like this.
It is. It's the textbook definition of undermining an investigation before it even properly starts.
Yeah.
The apartment where Ellen died was professionally cleaned and sanitized on January 27th, the very next day after the death. Crucially, the police actually gave permission for this cleanup to happen. They seemingly treated the scene as a closed case, a suicide, even though the ME hadn't formally finalized that ruling yet.
Think about that, you. This happened before detectives and their specialized forensics team secured a search warrant and returned to the scene on January 28th. What specifically is lost when a professional cleaning crew sanitizes a potential crime scene?
Oh, the loss is irreparable. When you have a death involving multiple stabbings like this, probably the most important piece of evidence beyond the body itself is the blood stain pattern analysis, or BPA. BPA can tell investigators things like the angle of attack, maybe the sequence of blows, the relative positions of the victim, and any potential assailant, whether the victim was standing, moving, falling. A cleaning crew, even with the best intentions, removes all this potential data. They wipe it clean. Furthermore, trace evidence. Things like fibers, hairs, latent fingerprints, maybe microscopic material that could tie an assailant to the scene. It's all wiped away.
Gone.
Exactly. By allowing the cleanup, the police fatally undermine their own ability to ever truly determine if someone else was involved, regardless of the eventual ruling. This procedural blunder permanently poisoned the well of physical evidence.
And that procedural failure was immediately followed by an even more glaring blunder concerning the chain of custody of potential evidence.
Yeah, this is another major issue. We have James Schwartzman entering the apartment on January 27th, the same day as the cleanup. Now, Schwartzman is Samuel Goldberg's uncle, and critically, at the time, he was the chairman of the Pennsylvania Judicial Conduct Board, an immensely influential position.
Okay, so a person with significant influence enters the scene. What did he do?
Schwartzman claimed he entered primarily to retrieve a funeral suit for his nephew, Samuel Goldberg. But he also admitted to removing items from the apartment. Specifically, work and personal laptops, phones, and credit cards belonging to both Ellen Greenberg and Samuel Goldberg. He cited a need to safeguard them.
Safeguard them from whom? The police.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? While police later requested and did retrieve these items, the chain of custody, which is the documented unbroken record of who had possession of a piece of evidence and when, was officially broken. It was broken the moment a private citizen, especially one connected to the fiancé and holding a powerful judicial oversight role, was allowed to remove potential evidence from a death scene before a proper forensic warrant was executed.
And the items that were eventually recovered, the laptop specifically, they immediately became subjects of fierce dispute regarding their content, didn't they? There's a crucial contradiction regarding Ellen's search history.
Yes, absolutely. Fast forward to 2019. A spokesperson for then Attorney General Josh Shapiro's office claimed that computer searches had been found that pointed toward suicide. This was used effectively to support their defense of the suicide ruling, suggesting Ellen had been researching methods.
Yet, legal representation for the Greenberg family strongly disputed that claim, citing a document that actually predated the AG's involvement in the case.
Correct. They pointed to an official police document from an earlier forensic examination done by the Philadelphia Regional Computer Forensics Laboratory. That document, according to the Greenberg team's filings, summarized the findings quite clearly. Keyword searches were done on every computer searching for suicide information, and the examination did not reveal anything remarkable.
Nothing remarkable, so a direct contradiction.
Exactly. You have an official police forensics lab document saying nothing remarkable, conflicting with a later statement from a politically charged AG's office, which was, at that point, trying to justify sticking with the suicide ruling. The question becomes, which set of information was given credence by officials, and why the discrepancy?
Beyond the evidence handling, the original narrative of the discovery, the story provided by Samuel Goldberg, began to crumble under closer scrutiny as well, exposing serious discrepancies. Let's start with the door latch, which was really the foundation of the locked room suicide theory.
Right. Goldberg claimed the apartment door was secured with that swing latch from the inside, implying Ellen locked herself in. However, the apartment manager later filed a statement confirming that the swing bar latch itself did not definitively prove the door had been locked from the inside by Ellen. It was structurally possible, apparently, for the door to be forced in such a way that the latch might engage afterwards, or perhaps be engaged from the outside through manipulation, potentially as a stalling tactic or a secondary element to obscure how entry was really gained.
Okay, so the locked door isn't as solid as initially presented. And what about the crucial part of his 911 narrative that he had help breaking the door down? That was directly contradicted too, right?
Absolutely. Goldberg claimed he was with a security guard when he forced the door open. The security guard in question, Phil Hanton, later filed a sworn declaration. In that declaration, Hanton stated unequivocally he was not there when Goldberg forced the door open.
Not there.
Not there. Furthermore, we have surveillance footage obtained later that reportedly showed Goldberg alone in the elevator just before the 911 call was made. So if he had just forced his way in and found a gruesome scene, why was his narrative about who was physically present with him at that critical moment so definitively false? It raises serious questions.
And if that weren't enough, there are phone records too.
Yes. A detailed analysis of phone records, conducted later by CNN as part of their reporting, contradicted claims made by two of Goldberg's relatives. Those relatives had apparently claimed they had been on the phone with Samuel Goldberg as he broke the door down. The phone records, according to CNN, didn't support that specific timeline.
So multiple core elements of the initial discovery narrative, who was there, the actual condition of the door lock, and the immediate context provided in the 911 call, they simply do not stand up to independent scrutiny based on later evidence and testimony. This makes the continued insistence on the suicide ruling, even just based on the narrative, let alone the physical evidence, deeply suspect.
It certainly complicates the picture enormously and undermines the foundation upon which the suicide ruling was built and defended.
So we have a compromise scene, a questionable narrative. But the biggest issue, the elephant in the room, remains the raw forensic data itself. That has to be addressed directly. 20 stab wounds and 11 bruises. For a suicide ruling to stand, the injuries must be consistent, somehow with self-infliction.
And this is where the medical science, it emphatically pushes back against the institutional ruling. It's why so many outside experts became involved and so vocal. We need to look closely at the wound profile. The key markers for typical suicidal stab wounds are usually things like hesitation marks. These are superficial cuts near the fatal wounds where the person might have tested the knife.
Those sort of tentative cuts.
Exactly. And the location is almost universally accessible, places like the chest or wrists. They also tend to be concentrated in one general area.
But Ellen's injuries defied this profile entirely.
They absolutely did. We have 20 stab wounds, 10 of which were located on the back, and the neck area is notoriously difficult, if not impossible, to reach with the force and depth required to inflict these specific injuries, especially multiple times.
10 wounds to the back and neck,
Yeah.
self-inflicted.
It beggars belief for most forensic experts. And then you add the 11 bruises found on her arm, abdomen, and right leg. Those strongly suggest a defensive struggle or some kind of restraint prior to or during the event. The sheer number, The distribution and the depth of these wounds are fundamentally inconsistent with typical self-inflicted injuries.
And technology that wasn't available back in 2011 was later brought in to reinforce that inconsistency, right? Specifically, photogrammetry was used to create a 3D anatomical recreation of her wounds. For you listening, what exactly does photogrammetry do that a normal 2D photo cannot, and why was it so critical in this case?
Photogrammetry is the science of making precise measurements from photographs. It allows experts to create a highly accurate 3D model of a scene, or in this case, the victim's body and the wounds on it. A standard 2D photograph can show you the location of a wound, sure, but it can't accurately determine the exact angle and trajectory of the blade relative to the body's position in 3 dimensions. The 3D modeling allowed the forensic team hired by the Greenbergs to visualize how a person, whether standing or sitting, would have had to hold the knife and exert force to produce the resulting wounds found on Ellen's body.
And the conclusion of that 3D modeling, what did it show?
It was critical. The analysis strongly suggested that, given the various angles, depths, and locations, particularly those on the back and neck, not all wounds could possibly have been self-inflicted. Some wounds required an angle or leverage that would be almost physically impossible for the victim to achieve on herself, especially considering the likely incapacitation that would have set in from the preceding wounds. This new technological evidence was part of, I believe, over 10 gigabytes of material provided to the Attorney General's office by the Greenberg legal team, yet it was ultimately dismissed when they upheld the suicide ruling.
The public rejection of the MEO ruling by multiple renowned pathologists is just deafening here. We're not talking about obscure consultants. We're talking about huge figures synonymous with major historical cases.
Exactly. I mean, it's quite something. I have to imagine Dr. Wecht and Dr. Lee rarely agree on lunch, let alone a controversial forensic ruling like this.
Yeah.
But they were pretty much uniform in their rejection here. Dr. Cyril H. Wecht, famous for challenging the JFK single bullet theory, among many other high-profile cases, reviewed this case. He determined it was strongly suspicious of homicide, stating emphatically, and this is a quote, that he did not know how they wrote this off as a suicide.
Strong words from Vecht.
Very. And joining him was Dr. Henry Lee, known globally for his work in the O.J. Simpson trial and countless others. He reviewed the evidence and concluded that the number and types of wounds and bloodstain patterns observed are consistent with a homicide scene. Unquote. When you have pathologists of this caliber, people whose careers are built on interpreting this exact kind of evidence, uniformly contradicting the local MEO, it signals a massive breakdown in the official narrative's credibility.
This forensic instability also leads us to the neuropathology dispute, which seems to represent a significant hole, maybe even a fabrication, in the early forensic documentation used to justify that initial flip from homicide to suicide by the MEO.
Yes, this is another really troubling aspect. A crucial element in supporting the suicide theory was the idea that none of the 20 stab wounds were immediately incapacitating. The thinking had to be that she could, theoretically, continue stabbing herself 20 times, even in the back of the neck.
Which already sounds improbable.
Highly improbable. Now, the original medical report cited an esteemed consulting neuropathologist, Dr. Lucy Balian Rourke Adams, to bolster this idea. The report implied her input suggested there was no definitive wound to the spine or brainstem that would have been immediately incapacitating, thus supporting the possibility of prolonged self-harm.
Okay, so they leaned on her expertise.
They appeared to. Yet years later, the truth about this consultation came out, largely thanks to reporting by the Philadelphia Inquirer. When they asked Dr. Rourke Adams about the case, her response was devastating to the original report's credibility. She stated in writing, "I have no recollection of such a case," and went on, "I would conclude that I did not see the specimen in question." Furthermore, investigation of MEO records confirmed, reportedly, that there was no bill, invoice, or report from Rourke Adams for this case.
Wow. So the argument that Ellen could have physically inflicted all 20 wounds on herself was, at least in part, supported by an official consultation that potentially never actually happened, or at the very least was never properly documented or billed.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. It removes, or at least severely questions, a foundational piece of the forensic justification used for classifying the death as suicide back in 2011.
And it undermines the credibility of the entire initial MEO process.
Absolutely. Furthermore, there was specific physical evidence noted during the autopsy of a defect in Greenberg's spinal cord, specifically in the dura mater around the C-spine area, if that defect was indeed a stab wound inflicted before death.
It would likely have been highly incapacitating, right, making 20 subsequent stab wounds impossible.
It's extremely likely, yes. It could cause paralysis or, at minimum, severe neurological dysfunction.
And speaking of that spinal defect and incapacitation, Chief Medical Examiner Lindsay Simon, in her 2025 reaffirmation of the suicide ruling, even provided an alternative explanation for it. But it's an explanation that itself seems to raise serious questions about the MEO's own procedures back in 2011.
Indeed. Dr. Simon contended in her report that the defect observed in the spinal cord could have been caused accidentally by a probe used during the autopsy procedure itself.
An iatrogenic injury caused by the examiners.
Potentially, yes. While she accepted that the overall distribution of injuries was, quote, admittedly unusual, she maintained her belief that Ellen Greenberg would be capable of inflicting these injuries herself. She further argued that even if the spinal injury was sustained ante mortem before death, it wouldn't necessarily have prevented her from continued movement or action.
But this requires you, the listener, to accept two pretty difficult things simultaneously. One, that an incredibly unusual pattern of 20 deep stab wounds, including to the back and neck, was self-inflicted, and that the original medical examiner's office might have accidentally caused the physical evidence of a potentially incapacitating severe spinal injury during their own examination. It's a defense of the ruling that seems to acknowledge profound flaws in the handling of the body and the scene by the original investigators, doesn't it?
It certainly highlights the layers of complexity and the questions surrounding the original examination and conclusions. It feels like defending the ruling requires explaining away multiple significant anomalies.
Given the massive forensic uncertainty and these documented procedural blunders, this case moved inevitably, perhaps, from a local forensic dispute into a deep political and legal labyrinth starting around 2018. That year, the case was taken over by the office of then Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro.
Right. The Greenberg family had desperately hoped the state AG's office, being theoretically more insulated from the Philadelphia Police Department and the local MEO, would bring fresh eyes and, critically, impartiality to the case. However, that hope turned out to be pretty short-lived. In 2019, Shapiro's office declared the investigation closed, officially supporting the original suicide ruling. This was despite the substantial new evidence the family's legal team had provided, including things like the 3D wound analysis we discussed and depositions from former MEO officials hinting at pressure.
But the controversy didn't end there. It actually exploded again in 2022, didn't it? When details of the political relationships between Josh Shapiro and the families of Samuel Goldberg, the fiancé, and James Schwartzman, the uncle who broke the chain of custody, were uncovered.
Yes. This exposure, largely driven by online investigators and then reported more widely by the media, immediately created a crisis of confidence. It raised the specter of institutional bias, or at least the appearance of it. The Greenberg legal team alleged that Shapiro's office was compromised due to these established political and, reportedly, financial donation relationships. To avoid the undeniable appearance of a conflict of interest, Shapiro's office was eventually forced to relinquish the case. They transferred the investigation to the Chester County District Attorney's Office.
Okay, so it gets handed off. What happened after the transfer to Chester County? Did they find anything different?
Well, that office eventually announced the investigation was inactive. They cited a forensic expert they consulted whose primary degree was, believe it or not, in entomology, the study of insects, and who reportedly lacked specific medical training in pathology. This led to further strong criticism from the Greenberg legal team, who basically felt the transfer was just a cynical attempt to bury the case elsewhere, to pass the buck without a genuine reinvestigation.
So, the criminal justice system route seemed stalled. Meanwhile, the Greenberg parents pursued justice through the civil system. This seems like an important strategic move. In October 2019, they filed a civil suit against the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office and specifically against Marlon Osborne, the pathologist who performed the original autopsy and made that suicide ruling. They weren't seeking criminal charges in this suit. Their goal was to force a change in the official manner of death on the certificate to either homicide or undetermined.
And this civil suit proved to be the pivotal legal pressure point. Why? Because civil litigation allows for discovery and depositions under oath, processes that often uncover facts or admissions that the criminal investigation process might have glossed over or missed. During the litigation process, Dr. Marlon Osborne, the original pathologist, was deposed. It was during this sworn deposition that he made a stunning admission. He admitted under oath to changing the manner of death from his initial inclination of homicide to the final ruling of suicide at the insistence of the police.
That admission is monumental. I mean, it confirms the suspicion all along. The very foundation of the suicide ruling was revealed to be institutional pressure, or at least a significant procedural compromise, not solely independent forensic fact. It validated essentially every suspicion the family and their independent experts had harbored for years.
Absolutely. And this whole process culminated in a major update in February 2025. Following a lawsuit from the Greenberg parents regarding the handling of the case and a subsequent settlement, Dr. Osborne filed a sworn statement. This statement represented a major public reversal of his professional opinion. He stated explicitly that he no longer agreed with the suicide ruling he had made back in 2011. He formally amended his professional opinion, stating that Ellen's death should be designated as something other than suicide. This is a public professional admission of error and in many ways a profound legal and moral victory for the family.
But the sources make it clear that this professional reversal, as significant as it sounds, didn't actually change the official death certificate or the public record, right?
That's the tragic and perhaps frustrating bureaucratic reality of the situation. Because Dr. Osborne was no longer employed by the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's office when he made this statement, his sworn reversal had no official binding influence on the current governmental record. The institutional ruling remains suicide. His statement acts as a powerful historical amendment, a piece of evidence in the ongoing fight, but it's not a current legal document capable of automatically overturning the existing certification.
And to sort of solidify that institutional position against Osborne's reversal, in October 2025, Philadelphia's current top pathologist, Chief Medical Examiner Lindsay Simon, reaffirmed the suicide ruling. She issued a comprehensive 32-page report defending the MEO's original finding from 2011.
So we see this enduring conflict playing out. The initial pathologist who made the controversial ruling has now officially reversed his position under oath, citing external pressure. Yet the current leadership of the same office has dug in and defended the original finding, even while acknowledging the injuries are admittedly unusual.
But the legal fight isn't over.
Not at all. It's still very much active and arguably gaining ground at the highest level. In July 2024, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, Eastern District, granted a petition for allowance of appeal. This means the state's highest court has agreed to review the legal challenges surrounding the determination of Ellen Greenberg's cause and manner of death.
The fact that the state Supreme Court is now involved, that signals they recognize the substantial ambiguity, the institutional failures alleged, and the enduring legal questions surrounding this case, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It's a clear indication that the fight over this death certificate, and by extension, the integrity of the original investigation and the subsequent handling of it, is far from resolved. The highest court in the state is now weighing in.
It's really no surprise that a case involving 20 stab wounds being ruled a suicide, combined with documented evidence tampering and institutional reversals, has become a massive media sensation. The sheer strangeness, the counterintuitive nature of the ruling made it an instant true crime lightning rod, drawing global attention because it just defies the conventional wisdom of forensic science for so many people.
Yeah, the case has received extensive and high-profile coverage across major television networks and publications, which really demonstrates the public's sustained disbelief, or at least deep skepticism, regarding the official conclusion. We're talking about detailed features on respected programs like CBS's 48 Hours, appearances on daytime shows like The Dr. Oz Show, and extensive coverage over the years in People magazine. The facts were also scrutinized on the true crime television show Accident, Suicide, or Murder, which explicitly tackles ambiguous death classifications.
And beyond that traditional media, the digital true crime community podcasts, forums, online investigators, they've really embraced this case, haven't they? It seems like a prime example of a potential miscarriage of justice. It is, in many ways, the perfect case study for exploring a breakdown of police procedure versus forensic reality.
Absolutely. It has been detailed on numerous successful true crime platforms, which have brought the specifics of the forensic inconsistencies and the procedural failures to a massive engaged audience. These include the Criminology podcast, which notably featured an interview with the influential pathologist Dr. Cyril H. Wecht, discussing his findings directly related to this case, as well as incredibly popular shows like Crime Junkie and Morbid, a true crime podcast, each bringing their own analysis and reach to the story.
This constant public pressure, demanding accountability and answers, it's reflected in the literature as well. Investigative journalist and legal commentator Nancy Grace dedicated an entire book to the subject, titled What Happened to Ellen? An American Miscarriage of Justice, which really highlights the ongoing frustration with the institutional resistance to re-examining or overturning the ruling.
And the case is continuing to draw high-profile attention, ensuring it remains in the public consciousness even as the legal battles play out slowly in the courts. There's an upcoming Hulu documentary series titled Death in Apartment 603, What Happened to Ellen Greenberg, which is set to premiere in September 2025. This project is directed by Nancy Schwartzman and, interestingly, is executive produced by Hollywood actors Elle Fanning and Dakota Fanning. The continued production of major media content like this demonstrates that the public and creators simply do not accept the official suicide ruling at face value. It keeps pressure on the system, including the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, to act decisively.
So as we synthesize everything we've looked at today, the stunning forensic inconsistency of 20 stab wounds, the police-authorized cleanup of the scene, destroying potential evidence, the broken chain of custody involving an influential figure, and the original pathologist's sworn reversal citing police pressure. We see a perfect storm where highly specific, controversial physical evidence is pitted directly against a sustained, repeatedly reaffirmed institutional ruling of suicide.
Right. The core conflict for you, the listener, to really grasp is understanding that this is not just a simple disagreement over opinion or interpretation. It involves documented breaches of standard investigative procedure. Breaches that fundamentally compromise the entire foundation of the initial investigation and the conclusions drawn from it. The fact that the initial pathologist admitted under oath he changed his mind due to police pressure, coupled with the current MEO's defense possibly involving an accidental injury during autopsy, it signals that institutional integrity, procedure, and potential influence are the true focal points of this entire decade-long legal and public battle.
Yet, despite all these documented procedural flaws and the sworn reversal, the current institution continues to hold the line on the suicide ruling. The legal system, the criminal side, had to be essentially bypassed through a civil action just to achieve the first significant breakthrough, getting that sworn reversal from the original medical examiner on record.
That fact is incredibly telling, isn't it? The criminal justice system, represented initially by the Philly PD and MEO, then the AG's office, and finally the Chester County DA, failed to meaningfully reinvestigate or correct the record in a way that satisfied the evidence. It took the power of discovery inherent in a civil lawsuit, the ability to compel testimony under oath, to pressure Dr. Osborne to finally admit publicly and legally to the institutional influence that appears to have led to the original highly contested ruling.
This leaves us with one powerful, provocative thought to consider as we wrap up this deep dive. Given the documented history here of, at best, incompetence and procedural errors, and at worst, potential political conflicts of interest and conflicting medical opinions, how does a civil suit, a private legal action by the parents, become the most effective tool remaining to force public institutions to reevaluate contested evidence and potentially acknowledge error, even years after an official ruling has been made and defended? And what does the partial success of that civil pressure, now landing the case before the state Supreme Court, mean for public confidence in the integrity and reliability of the entire judicial medical system moving forward? Especially when that system's highest court is now forced to weigh the integrity of its own official reports against such a mountain of contradictory evidence and procedural questions. That challenge of accountability, systemic accountability, is what this case truly represents today.